Tonight's presenter, Jeffrey von Arx, S.J., is the Thomas I. Gasson, S.J. Professor for 2018-2019. Funded by a gift from the Jesuit community at Boston College, the Gasson Chair is the oldest endowed professorship at Boston College and is held by a distinguished Jesuit scholar in any discipline. We are pleased that Father von Arx has been affiliated with the School of Theology and Ministry this year in his role as Gasson Professor. It's been a real privilege for us. A graduate of Princeton and Yale, as well as the Weston Jesuit School of Theology, Father von Arx began his academic career at Georgetown University and taught history there for 16 years. And during his tenure at Georgetown, he served as chair of the history department and was the founding director of Georgetown's Center for Australian and New Zealand Studies. Father von Arx later served as dean of Fordham College at Rose Hill, and in 2004 was elected president of Fairfield University, serving in that role until 2017. Father von Arx is a historian who has written or taught in the areas of British and Irish history, Australian history, church history, and historiography. In 1999, he was elected a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society, and he is the author of the book Progress and Pessimism, Religion, Politics, and History in Late 19th Century Britain. He's also the editor and contributor to Varieties of Ultramontanism. Currently, Father von Arx serves as superior and director of John Lafarge House in Cambridge, an independent Jesuit community and house of studies for Jesuits doing graduate work in the Boston area. He is also currently working on a book project on Cardinal Manning, featured in this evening's presentation. So I ask that you please join me in welcoming the 2018-2019 Gasson Professor, Jeffrey von Arx, a distinguished Jesuit University administrator and history scholar.
Thank you, Tom. It's always nice to hear yourself introduced so glowingly. Okay, who's that? That's Cardinal Manning. Okay, that's what an English archbishop looked like in the 19th century, probably an Anglican archbishop as well, because they kind of imitated each other. And on your right, that is Charles Stuart Parnell, right, who will figure prominently in this talk. Very good. Both by the noted caricaturist Spy, who published many caricatures of important British political, cultural, social figures in Vanity Fair through the 19th century. Google him at some point. You'll see pretty much everybody who is anybody in 19th century Britain has a caricature by him. If you didn't, you were nobody. Okay, so this is a story about how the Roman Catholic Church came to terms with Democratic Party politics, that's with a small d, in Great Britain in the second half of the 19th century. It's a story that interests me, and it may interest you, because that's still the way the Catholic Church engages with the liberal state in the United States today. And of course, that's liberal state from the point of view of political theory, not liberal versus conservative. I got interested in this subject because it seemed to me that Cardinal Henry Edward Manning, the Archbishop of Westminster and head of the English Roman Catholic hierarchy from 1865 to 1892, worked this engagement out, and in many ways anticipated in practice the thought of the great Jesuit philosopher and political thinker John Courtney Murray. I took a course on Murray from Father Brian Hare at St. John's Seminary just across the street about 40 years ago. Is Brian here tonight? He sometimes comes to these. We hope that he will. Cardinal Manning worked out this engagement in relationship to Irish Home Rule, about which you'll be hearing a lot in this paper. A bit of background. In the 19th century, Ireland was ruled directly from London as an integral part of the United Kingdom. The Irish sent 100 MPs to the UK Parliament in Westminster. The majority of those Irish MPs, about 90, the other 10 were Protestant Ulster Unionists, were elected for majority Catholic constituencies, and they favored greater autonomy for Ireland within the United Kingdom. Basically, the reestablishment of an Irish Parliament in Dublin, it had been abolished in 1801, to deal with Irish domestic affairs. This goal was referred to as Home Rule, and it was the policy objective of the Irish Parliamentary Party, also known as the Nationalist Party, under the leadership of the charismatic Charles Stuart Parnell, who was, interestingly enough, himself a Protestant landlord, although, as we shall see, not a very prudent one. Home Rule would become the political issue, not only in Ireland, but also in the United Kingdom as a whole, where it roiled British politics and preoccupied the two great British political parties, the Liberals, this time with a capital L, and the Conservatives for 3 decades, from the mid-1880s until the Easter Rising put an end to the question. On more than one occasion, as we shall see, British governments were made and unmade by the Irish Parliamentary Party, with its block of 90 votes, switching sides in Parliament, according to which party was more favorable to their cause. A bit about Cardinal Manning's situation as we begin the story. The death of his patron, Pius IX, and the election of Leo XIII as Pope in 1878 meant for Manning not only the loss of a friend and patron, but as a consequence, a considerable loss of his once powerful influence in Rome. It was therefore without the benefit of Manning's advice that the new Pope and his advisors began to formulate and carry out what one modern historian of the Church has called the world plan of Leo XIII. The impetus for the new departure in the international politics of the Vatican was the need to assure the position of the Church, and especially of the papacy, after the loss of the Papal States to the Italian Kingdom in 1870. Pius IX, who had suffered the loss of the patrimony of Peter, had attempted to compensate by strengthening the internal cohesion of the Church and ultramontane control over national churches. In this enterprise, Manning had been an enthusiastic and effective collaborator. This he had achieved through active engagement in the campaign for the decrees on papal primacy and papal infallibility in the dogmatic Constitution Pastor Aeternus at the First Vatican Council. The new departure of the new papacy to secure its role through the restoration of its international position the new departure of the papacy was to secure its role through the restoration of its international position. For Leo, the restoration of that position meant not so much the repossession of the geography of the Papal States, if that could not, as seemed unlikely, be accomplished, but instead the reestablishment of the authority of the papacy as a key player in international affairs, in Europe most importantly and throughout the world. Here, the most representative, and from Leo's point of view, the most momentous of the very limited successes of this policy was the invitation of the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck in 1885 to have the Pope mediate a dispute between Germany and Spain over possession of the Caroline Islands in the South Pacific. This invitation the Pope optimistically but rather ingenuously took to be an implicit recognition by Bismarck of his temporal sovereignty. For the Leonine papacy's vision of itself as a referee or arbiter in international affairs to become a possibility, it was necessary that the papacy should attempt to resolve outstanding disputes and overcome animosities that were a source of discord between it and the great European powers, and show itself accommodating, insofar as this was possible, to their concerns. It was for this reason that early in his papacy, Leo sought, through direct negotiations with Bismarck, to bring to a close the Kulturkampf, the conflict over the role of the Church in the German Empire that had followed the Vatican Council and German unification. In this he succeeded. Bismarck's invitation to him was his reward, even if it meant that the Pope sometimes acted over the heads and against the advice and interests of the Center Party in Germany, the main Catholic political party in the new empire, and indeed the German episcopate. Diplomatic relations were central to Leo's project of having the papacy recognized as a player in international affairs, not only with the Catholic powers, but also with non-Catholic powers, like Germany, Russia, and Great Britain. In the case of Britain, the question of diplomatic relations was complex. The Irish hierarchy was strongly opposed to the possibility that the affairs of the Irish Church might pass through the hands of a nuncio resident in London or a British ambassador at the Vatican, rather than through direct dealing between the Irish bishops and the Pope. And it is not surprising to learn that Cardinal Manning as well was opposed to diplomatic relations between England and the Holy See. Manning's attitude on this question is best reflected in a letter to Cardinal Cullen, the Archbishop of Dublin, in 1878. There, Manning stated that a nuncio, and I quote, would probably produce conflict between us, the bishops of England and Ireland, and the government, and greatly relax the close intimacy of the bishops with the Holy See. Such a nuncio would, I believe, be a center of intrigue and a source of incorrect information in Rome. And he continues, in Rome, they do not seem to realize that nuncios belong to the period when governments and public laws of Europe were Catholic. At this day, the governments are powerless to help the Holy See. The real governments are the people, and the true nuncios are the bishops. It is the last part of his statement to Cullen that we can recognize as offering Manning's characteristic point of view on the actual state of relations between church and state. It was a mistake for the papacy to rely on official relations with governments to advance the mission of the church. Such a policy represented a failure of political understanding because secular governments no longer could or should be expected to enter into special relations with the Roman Catholic Church through concordats and confer unique benefits on it. To do so would violate the first principle of the secular character of the liberal state as Manning had come to understand it, that the state should be even-handed among religious groups and not confer special privileges on any of them. The appropriate way for the churches to interact with the liberal state was at the level of popular or democratic politics. This meant that political leadership in the churches must be local. In the Catholic community, Manning believed this meant the bishops. The degree of cooperation of the papacy in matters of concern to the English government varied with the prospects of the establishment of official relations. The culmination of the Roman policy of placating the English government in the hopes of diplomatic recognition was the Roman condemnation in May of 1883 of Archbishop Croke of Cashel's role in the Parnell Testimonial Fund. Croke, perhaps the most advanced nationalist of the Irish hierarchy, had been skating on thin ice for some time in what more cautious Catholics in Ireland and Rome, and certainly the British government, regarded as encouragement of agitation and tolerance of disorder in Ireland. When Croke was foremost in contributing a large sum to a testimonial fund for the rescue of Charles Stuart Parnell's heavily mortgaged estate, Rome reacted with the publication of a circular letter to the Irish bishops condemning the Parnell testimonial and admonishing any bishop who should take any part whatsoever in recommending or promoting it. Clearly, they were referring to Croke. The affair of the Roman circular provoked a crisis in the papacy's relation with the Irish Church, as it was met with silence from the hierarchy, restiveness and resentment among the lower clergy, and denunciation from certain quarters of the laity. In the nationalist press, the papacy was accused of having entered into an unholy alliance with England against the Irish, who would know how to stand for their rights against both England and Rome. The intensity of Irish reaction, coupled with a growing realization that the British government was not seriously interested in diplomatic relations, led Roman authorities to recognize the need for a reassessment of their policy toward Ireland. Rome's need to restructure its power and influence in Ireland after the disaster of the Roman Circular was the occasion of Cardinal Manning's rehabilitation there. Apart from his brief attendance at the conclave that elected Leo XIII in 1878, Manning had not been to Rome since 1876, when in the declining years of Pius IX, he already found the atmosphere changed. When he went to Rome, therefore, in October of 1883 to pay the regular visit expected of a diocesan bishop, he went, as he recorded, with no anticipation of satisfaction. An absence of 4 years and the industrious misrepresentation of many people had, as I know, created strong prejudices against me. I am told that it was intentional that I was not consulted about Ireland or our government. For the last 2 years I have been silent, and I did not look for what has happened. What happened was a strong desire on the part of Leo XIII to have Manning's advice, especially on Ireland and the question of diplomatic relations with England. He, I'm quoting Manning, the Pope, desired me to come every Wednesday, so that in 5 weeks I had more than 6 audiences of more than 1 hour each. There is no subject on which he did not speak or allow me to speak. We spoke on the religious state of England 3 times, on relations with Russia, Austria, Berlin, France, very fully, on the 2 notes of his own pontificate, the intellectual and the diplomatic, and most fully on Ireland and our government. I do not think I could have had a more complete admission into the knowledge which for the last 2 years seemed to be withheld. Manning's successful visit to Rome in 1883 marked a turning point, not only in his own fortunes and reputation in Leonine Rome, but also in the policy of the papacy, especially toward Ireland. For that policy now began moving along the lines that Manning recommended. As we have seen, Manning was convinced that in a democratic age, strong bishops were the key to the Church's ability to relate to the people. And he had been concerned for several years about the weakness of the Irish episcopacy after the death of his friend and collaborator, Cardinal Cullen. By trying to deal with governments instead of with the people through their bishops, Manning believed that the papacy had further weakened the Church's position in Ireland. After Manning's October 1883 visit, however, things began to change. A number of vacancies in the Irish episcopate were filled against the recommendation of the British government. In March of 1884, the Pope summoned a representative group of Irish bishops to meet with him later in the year in Rome. Buoyed by these indications that Rome was prepared to respect their judgment, the Irish bishops launched a major initiative of their own at their annual general meeting in October of 1884. The Irish bishops had long been frustrated by the failure of the British government to address adequately the issue of education for Catholics in Ireland. They therefore used the occasion of their meeting to call on Parnell's Irish Parliamentary Party to take up the education question in the British Parliament. The bishops' vote of confidence in Parnell's party represented an understood alliance between Church and the national movement, which the Church had betimes held at arm's length, and the final step in Parnell's consolidation of his leadership of nationalist Ireland. Certainly it caused consternation in the British government, where the Church had always been regarded as a counterpoise and brake on the national movement. But the initiative apparently took the Pope by surprise as well, and so offered the British government a last opportunity to attempt to recoup their losses if they could once again convince Rome to rein in the Irish Church. In the midst of these important developments, the Archbishop of Dublin, Cardinal McCabe, died on February 11, 1885. The appointment of McCabe's successor, who would occupy the key see at the heart of the Irish Church, was recognized by all concerned as of critical importance. McCabe had been well regarded by the British government as a moderating and restraining force on the Irish scene. And with the new departure on the part of the Irish bishops represented by their alliance with the nationalists, the British government was deeply concerned about his replacement. From the beginning, the government's unofficial agent in Rome, George Errington, identified William Walsh, president of Maynooth, the National Catholic Seminary, as the candidate most to be avoided. Walsh was a violent and dangerous man, Errington told the foreign minister, Lord Granville, where the British government had a right to wish and expect that as important a post as the See of Dublin should be occupied by a man of loyal and moderate views. The dynamic element of the Irish hierarchy, on the other hand, recognized the need for a leader in Dublin, which McCabe had not been. Walsh was the favorite of the nationalists among the bishops, Archbishop Croke of Cashel commending him as a young, active, zealous, earnest, and wonderfully gifted man. It was clear that both sets of influences, that of the government and that of the activist Irish bishops, would be brought to bear in Rome around the candidacy of Walsh, and so the stage was set for a contest of wills. Cardinal Manning, as we have seen, had certain predispositions that would operate in this contest prior to any consideration of particular candidates. In the first place, he was opposed to the interference of the British government at Rome, especially if this should lead to formal relations between London and Rome. This was not only because that way of conducting relations between the church and the state would bypass him, but because he was convinced that it was incompatible with the way in which the church should function in a democratic political order. Second, he shared with the more advanced nationalists in the Irish hierarchy the opinion that the Irish church had for some time lacked and now required strong leadership in key positions in the hierarchy. This was not only, however, as the historian of the Irish church at this period would have it, talking about Emmett Larkin, a matter of Manning's usual emphasis on clerical power. Manning believed that the strong local leadership in the church, inevitably conceived at this stage of the church's history as clerical, and close union between priests and people were essential to responsible and active participation of the Catholic community in national political life. It is not surprising, therefore, that as the contest between the British government and the Irish church developed, and as the candidates for the vacant see of Dublin emerged, Manning became an enthusiastic backer of William Walsh, the candidate of the majority nationalist bloc within the Irish hierarchy, and as we have seen, strongly opposed by the British government. Manning had an opportunity to consult with a group of Irish bishops when, in April 1885, Archbishop Croke, their leader, and 6 of his colleagues stopped with Manning in London on the way to Rome for their visit to the Pope. Immediately after this meeting with the Irish bishops, Manning wrote to the Pope. He emphasized the need for unity among the Irish episcopate and the importance of their effective and responsible leadership of the Irish people. Although Walsh was not mentioned in this letter, one has the sense from the themes of unity and leadership that he chose to emphasize that Manning was preparing the way for a campaign on his behalf. Later in the summer, Manning wrote to Croke, now in Rome, asking for news and offering his assistance. Croke responded that it was imperative to warn the Pope of the danger at this point of appointing anyone but Walsh, and begged Manning to do so as the only person who could offer the Pope this advice. Manning obliged and wrote a letter to the Pope in which he then paraphrased for Croke. He had stressed with the Pope, he reported to Croke, the danger of even seeming to be swayed in this choice by the English government, the united wish of the Irish bishops for Walsh, and the worthiness of Walsh in that order. You may confide, Manning assured Croke in the conclusion, in my leaving nothing undone that I can do. On June 23rd, the Pope announced the decision to appoint William Walsh to the vacant see of Dublin. Errington, the English agent in Rome, was deeply disappointed and recognized correctly that the decision put an end to any chance of relations with Rome. Manning's reaction on receiving the news from Bishop Herbert Vaughan, his protege then in Rome, was happy but surprised. Your letter of the 24th was a relief to me, Manning wrote. I thought my letter to Pope Leo would have vexed him. We have been on the brink of a very great scandal. Rightly or wrongly, the feeling in Ireland about Dublin was full of danger. For Manning, the significance of the Walsh appointment was the following. At one level, the point at issue for Manning was the same as it was for the Irish bishops. Would the power of the papacy be exercised through the bishops on their advice, or would the British government have its own access to the Pope and an ability to influence his decisions independent of the Irish hierarchy? For Manning, of course, the notion of a divided authority within the church, especially when the state was behind that division, was anathema. It was, after all, the reason that he had left the Anglican Church in the first place, a church in which authority was divided and shared with the state was to Manning inconceivable. Manning saw the appointment of a strong figure like Walsh as essential not just for the unity, but also for the mission of the Catholic Church in Ireland. If the Church were to provide leadership that the people would trust in the complex and potentially dangerous future that Irish Catholics faced, they must be able to look to their Church for guidance with confidence that the Church was not compromised by a prior engagement to the British state. But Manning would not have, and did not, in fact, look on the alliance between the Catholic Church and the Irish Parliamentary Party as a falling away of Catholic power in any sense. Given Manning's position first on the relationship of church and state, that the Church must in the first instance engage peoples and not governments, and second, on the appropriate level of the Church's encounter with the political order at the level of democratic politics, there is every reason to believe that Manning approved the Irish hierarchy's decision to enter into a compact with the Irish Parliamentary Party as it had done in 1884, and considered the arrangement not a falling away of Catholic power, but rather its appropriate and responsible exercise. Manning's relations with Charles Stuart Parnell and the Home Rule movement he epitomized are more significant and revealing of his position on the role of the Church in politics than any other episode in his long career. I've argued elsewhere that by 1885, Manning had long since accepted and even embraced the implications for religious bodies of the secularization of the liberal state and the rise of democratic politics. The chief of those implications, as far as the political activity of the Church was concerned, was the need to relate to the structures of government at the level of popular politics. But the turn to popular politics on the part of the churches raised a number of important issues. What role should the Church play in the organization of popular politics as it involved Roman Catholics? A related but separate question was how would leadership, that is to say the bishops, function within the Catholic community in relation to popular politics when it was a matter of issues like education that were of concern to Roman Catholics? Both of these questions, and of course the history of popular politics more generally, raised the issue of mass democratic political parties and what the Church's attitude toward those bodies would be. The possibility of a Catholic political party had been raised more than once in the history of the English Catholic community since the restoration of the hierarchy in 1851, and it was raised again in 1885. In August, in anticipation of the upcoming general election, and with the education question very much in mind, the English Catholic Bishop of Nottingham, Edward Bagshaw, suggested in a letter to the Tablet, the English Catholic Monthly, that English Roman Catholics abandon the two major political parties, the Liberals and the Conservatives, and form a party of their own. Bagshaw proposed an alliance between an English and an Irish Catholic party, in which English Catholics would support home rule and Catholic education in Ireland, and Irish Catholics make common cause with English Catholics in Parliament for causes like denominational education in England. A possible model for such a party was, of course, the Catholic Centre Party in Germany. Manning was well aware of the Centre Party and of its role in standing up for the Church against Bismarck during the Kulturkampf. But it is significant that he manifested no public enthusiasm for Bagshaw's proposals for a Catholic political party in England and deprecated it in private. In October, Manning issued an election manifesto, his How Shall Catholics Vote at the Coming Parliamentary Election, which was published in the Dublin Review and a number of other Catholic journals. This would have been the occasion, had he wished, to say something in favor of an initiative to form a Catholic party. At the beginning of the article, he acknowledged the interest that had been expressed in the possibility of such a party. But it is significant that in the remainder of the article, he did not return to this subject. Manning confined himself to advising Catholic voters in England to put questions to parliamentary candidates that had to do with denominational education in England, then Manning's greatest domestic concern. Beyond this, it was rather pointedly stated that Catholics were free to vote as they saw fit. Now, while it was true that these instructions favored the conservatives who supported denominational education in the interests of the Anglican Church, more of whom could and did give the required assurances than liberals who by and large favored non-denominational education, they assumed that Catholics would vote for candidates of existing parties and gave no indication of support for anything like a separate Catholic party. The question of the Church's relation to popular politics in the concrete circumstances of 1885, as even Bagshaw in his way recognized, raised inevitably the issue of the Irish Parliamentary Party led by Charles Stuart Parnell. This party, while it was not confessionally Catholic, was overwhelmingly Catholic in its popular constituency and predominantly Catholic in the numbers it returned to Parliament. Indeed, its members were often the only Catholics in Parliament, and everyone recognized that the party would become even stronger in its parliamentary representation as a result of the recent franchise expansion. How did the existence of this party affect the Church's role in the organization of popular politics and leadership within the Catholic community on issues of Catholic concern? It's important to recognize that as head of the English Roman Catholic hierarchy, Manning could only approach these questions as having been to some extent already determined. The Irish Parliamentary Party, as Parnell had molded it, was a very solid historical given, and the stance of the Roman Catholic Church toward the party was less a matter of Manning's choosing than that of the Irish hierarchy. But Manning was not without choice in his attitude or without influence in his policy toward the givens of the situation that he faced, and the choices he made are revealing. It may be that in his dealings with the Irish party and the Irish Church, Manning made a virtue of necessity. But by now it should be obvious that part of what was distinctive and original in Manning's political approach was his belief, with the turn toward democracy, that the Church, at least in England and Ireland, was well placed to engage, and so could be confident in entering into positive and constructive relations with popular political movements as it found them. The two most significant givens that Manning faced with regard to the Irish dimension of the Church's engagement with popular politics were, first of all, of course, the commitment of Parnell's party to Home Rule for Ireland, and second, the decision that had been taken by the Irish bishops in October of 1884 to place their confidence in the Irish Parliamentary Party to achieve the goals of the Irish Church in the field of education. Manning seems to have made no statement, either publicly or in his correspondence, on the clerical nationalist alliance of 1884. It is probably significant, however, that the tablet, published again by his protege, Bishop Herbert Vaughan of Salford, and as the voice of the English Old Catholics, not otherwise noted for being well disposed to Irish causes, applauded the new departure, observing that the Irish bishops really had no other course open to them if they wanted to achieve their goals. On the education question, at least, both the English and the Irish Church had experienced such high levels of frustration with the existing government that even the mouthpiece of the English Old Catholics was willing to contemplate new departures in popular politics on the part of their Irish co-religionists. Much more significant of Manning's attitude toward the clerical national alliance, however, was the fact, as we have seen, that in 1885 he strongly supported William Walsh for the See of Dublin. Walsh was the candidate of that wing of the Irish Church, then led by Archbishop Croke, that was supposed to be nationalist and was certainly behind the new opening to the party, as was Walsh himself. Had Manning not approved of the initiative taken by the Irish Church in placing the cause of Catholic education in the hands of Parnell's party, with all that that implied for the mutual relationship of party and church, he would have had a very effective way of communicating that disapproval and even bringing the alliance to an end. He could have scuttled Walsh's nomination and ensured the appointment of what the British government would have considered a moderate. The close political relationship that immediately grew up between Manning and Walsh and continued until Manning's death, always assumed the Irish Church's commitment to the party. Not even the Parnell divorce case led either man to question that political given. On Home Rule, Manning underwent an education that changed both his position on that particular issue and, through the process of that change, his attitude toward the more general question of how leadership would function within the Catholic community in relationship to popular politics. Manning's position on Irish self-government was as follows. He opposed the separation between England and Ireland, and so was opposed to an Irish Parliament because he believed that the creation of a separate Parliament in Dublin with the withdrawal of the Irish MPs from Westminster would lead to separation. Certainly, apart from what might have been Manning's genuine concern for the indissolubility of the United Kingdom, the reason for his opposition to a settlement that would see the Irish MPs leave Westminster is not hard to imagine. It would have meant the near complete loss of Catholic members from the House of Commons who might be counted on to support the causes of the Catholic Church in England. Manning never changed his position opposing the exclusion of the Irish members at Westminster, but of course others did. When the Liberal Prime Minister, William Gladstone, introduced the first Home Rule Bill in 1886, it was with the provision that the Irish members would be excluded from the Imperial Parliament. By the time the bill reached its second reading in June, the government, responding to widespread criticism on the issue and in order to win support for the bill, let it be known that they would abandon this point and consider schemes for retention. Parnell, too, after strongly favoring exclusion, eventually came around on the issue, although more slowly, announcing for retention in 1888. Retention of the Irish MPs at Westminster would eliminate Manning's most serious objection to a separate Irish Parliament and so facilitate a conversion to Home Rule as Irish nationalists understood it, although one could argue that it was not Manning who converted, but the politicians who came around to his way of seeing things. It was not, however, Manning's conversion to Home Rule as understood by the Irish nationalists that is most significant in terms of his attitude toward Irish popular politics. Indeed, there is a problem reflected in the historical literature in saying just when or even whether Manning decisively declared for Home Rule understood in this way. Such a lack of definiteness on the part of the otherwise neither reticent nor ambiguous Cardinal Archbishop of Westminster is both surprising and revealing. The truth is that while Manning had views of his own about Home Rule, which he was willing to express to private correspondence, when it came to public pronouncements and public policy, Manning was determined to follow a lead given to him from Ireland. This lead came principally from Archbishop Walsh of Dublin, but Manning was astute enough an observer to realize that Walsh's lead, in its turn, grew out of a complex relationship between the Irish Church and the popular political movement, which was Parnell's party. The first indication of willingness to follow the Irish lead is a most important one. We've seen that in October of 1885, Manning had offered advice to Roman Catholic voters in the English constituencies on how they should vote in the coming parliamentary election. They were to pose certain questions to candidates that had to do with their support for denominational education in England and their willingness to see a royal commission summoned to review the operation of the 1870 Education Act. On November 21st, Parnell issued a manifesto to the Irish voters of Great Britain on his behalf, calling on them to vote against all Liberals then in power because the Liberals would not support Home Rule. In most cases, of course, the effect of these dual instructions to Irish Catholic voters in Great Britain would be the same: support for the Conservatives. So the question of a conflict between the English Catholic agenda for denominational education and the Irish agenda for Home Rule did not arise. But with the so-called Hawarden Kite, K-I-T-E, Hawarden was Gladstone's country estate, and the kite was an announcement that he made. The Hawarden Kite, which announced Gladstone and thus the Liberals Party conversion to Home Rule in December of 1885, the political situation, as you can imagine, changed dramatically. Given the prospects of the Irish party swinging their votes back to the Liberals, who were not to be counted on to support denominal education in England, conflict between these two agendas, that of the Irish and that of the English Church, could and did arise. It was suggested in a number of English Catholic newspapers that the interests of the Irish movement should be subordinated to the interests of English Catholics in the question of education. Walsh wrote to Manning protesting these proposals, as well as attacks that had been made on the Irish bishops for their alliance with the Irish Parliamentary Party. Manning responded immediately, "I will say at once that I know of no one who desires to subordinate the Irish movement to any English question." This was perhaps less true than a reflection of the policy Manning himself had determined to follow, on which he proceeded to reassure Walsh. "And you may rely on me for refusing to subordinate the Irish movement to any English question, as I believe you would refuse to subordinate the Irish movement to your own education." This was a perceptive observation on Manning's part of the constrained position that the Irish hierarchy now found itself in relationship to the Home Rule movement. Manning would follow the policy of publicly backing the Irish bishops in their arrangements with the Parliamentary Party, even though, at this point, he still remained convinced that a separate parliament in Dublin was not necessarily a good idea. Nor was Manning's deference to Walsh and the Irish bishops in the matter of subordinating English education to Irish Home Rule only for their own consumption. When the first Home Rule Bill was defeated in June of 1886, and Gladstone's government fell, meaning that there'd be a new general election, Manning wrote to Herbert Vaughan, who was probably not eager to receive them, with instructions for the coming election. I quote, "The dissolution is on one issue. We cannot evade it. We cannot put education before it. The Irish vote in England would be lost by doing so. We should seem to oppose Ireland. We should hopelessly divide our own people. The education question would not be listened to apart from Ireland. We can speak on both, but not on education alone. Education cannot be helped at this election, nor do I think it will be hindered. This will need much thought and counsel, but it is inevitable." Given what we know of the intensity and duration of Manning's campaign for voluntary education in England, his willingness to subordinate this cause to an Irish Home Rule that he did not entirely agree with is quite significant. It may well be, as Manning himself indicated, that this subordination was inevitable. But the inevitable is only so on the basis of certain assumptions. In the present case, the operative assumption for Manning was that the Catholic Church in the whole United Kingdom was ineluctably committed to popular politics. And it was committed to popular politics not in the abstract, but to the popular politics of the mass democratic political party, with the exigencies that such a commitment brought with it, and subject to the dynamics of a close engagement, the dynamics that a close engagement with a political party entailed. More concretely still, the Church, both in England as well as in Ireland, was committed to the Irish Parliamentary Party of Charles Stuart Parnell. This was the party to which the vast majority of Roman Catholics in the United Kingdom gave their allegiance, and if the Roman Catholic Church was to have an impact and effect in the country, it must work in and through that party. The decisive and conclusive character of the Church's turn toward democratic politics as it actually existed in England and Ireland was the reason why a Catholic party on the model of the German Centre Party never got off the ground. Popular politics, by definition, can only be organized from the top down to a limited extent. And even if the bishops had wished to establish a Catholic party, most Catholics, by 1885 anyway, were already taken up in a political party, Parnell's party. This party, while composed almost entirely of Catholics, and including most of the Catholics in the United Kingdom, was certainly not, despite the allegations of Protestants and secularists, a Catholic confessional party, even in the sense that the Centre Party in Germany was Catholic and confessional. The Church, in the person of its bishops, could influence the party to reinforce, for example, the party's commitment to nonviolence and constitutionalism. It could use the party for its own ends, as, for example, the standard bearer in the Church's fight for denominational education. It could criticize and even attempt to correct the party, as it did on the issue of moral leadership in the Parnell divorce scandal. But it certainly could not control or lead the party. Its ability to use the party for its own ends was limited. And in some areas, the whole national question, for example, the Church had to follow or acquiesce in the party's lead. Any effort to use the Church to control the national movement, as the papacy would discover a few years later when it futilely condemned the nationalist plan of campaign, a boycott of Irish landlords, was bound to fail, as indeed it did in that case. All of this the Irish bishops, certainly Walsh, understood, and clearly Manning understood it as well. That understanding was demonstrated not simply in Manning's deference to Walsh's lead, but in his strong support for Walsh's policy in regard to the national movement, in England, in Ireland, and indeed in Rome for the rest of Manning's life. By 1886, the Catholic Church was committed decisively to popular politics in the United Kingdom, with all the complexity and ambiguity that such a commitment entailed. We have argued that it is not adequate to see this commitment of the Church by leaders like Walsh and Manning as a matter of bowing to the inevitable. The commitment was inevitable only because Church leaders like Manning believed that it was necessary and appropriate. Manning's approach to an engagement with the liberal state contrasts sharply, obviously, with that of Leo XIII that we have described above. Leo negotiated with Bismarck over the Kulturkampf as a head of state, which was the recognition he desired to solidify the position of the papacy in international affairs after the loss of the Papal States. This he did, as I have indicated, over the heads of the German hierarchy and the Catholic Center Party, and arguably sometimes against their interests. There is a line to be drawn, sadly, between Leo's policy and that of later popes with another German leader that effectively quashed any prophetic voice on the part of the German hierarchy and emasculated the Catholic Center Party as an effective opposition to the Nazi regime. Cardinal Manning, on the other hand, was completely committed to the engagement of the Catholic Church with the liberal state in the only way it could be engaged, at the level of democratic party politics, in which the Church sought no advantage or special privilege, but sought to be treated fairly on a level playing field. This entailed in its turn the hands-on engagement of the Church and Church leaders, clerical and then increasingly lay, with political parties as complex and even as messy as that engagement could sometimes be. One of the reasons I became so interested in Cardinal Manning's political involvement, as I indicated at the beginning of this talk, is because it reminded me so much of John Courtney Murray's later thinking on church-state relations in We Hold These Truths and elsewhere. Manning was working out in practice what Murray would later articulate as a theory: the essential compatibility between Catholicism properly understood and the institutions of a democratically structured modern state. If there is a line between Leo XIII's policy in regard to the Kulturkampf and the Reichskonkordat of 1933, so is there a line between Manning's policy in regard to Irish Home Rule, the thought of John Courtney Murray, the Church's engagement with democratic politics in the United States and elsewhere, and Dignitatis Humanae, the Second Vatican Council's Declaration on Religious Liberty. Thank you. Okay, folks, any questions, comments? I know that was a lot to digest. I think I had a sense that we covered a lot of church history and Irish history and English history in the course of 50 minutes. So, any questions? Anything that wasn't clear that I can clarify for you?
So, Cardinal Manning was looking for...
Mics, yeah. Use the mics, please. Thank you.
Cardinal Manning was looking for publicly supported Catholic schools, basically?
So, yes. So the Act of 1870 set up a dual system of education in which denominational schools were supported to a certain extent by government grants, and non-denominational schools were basically fully supported. He didn't think that was fair, and so he was looking to get that changed. So that was his agenda over education that in the elections that we're talking about.
And one other question, did English Catholics tend to vote as a bloc in English elections?
Well, of course, the English Catholic community was somewhat diverse. There were the old Catholics. They tended to be conservatives by and large. The majority of the English Catholic population were Irish, and so they tended to support the liberals whom they thought were more likely to adopt home rule than not. But typically, they voted in whichever way Charles Stuart Parnell told them to.
Jeff, thank you for a wonderful talk. I was hoping you might say a little bit more about the more juicy story of Parnell's fall from grace, but that's for another day, I'm sure. My question is, you mentioned in passing the Roman Circular apropos Archbishop Croke of Cashel, and I just didn't quite catch what that meant. And of course,
the Roman Circular. So the Roman Circular was a statement from the Vatican condemning participation in the Parnell testimonial.
And was that defensive of Parnell, or was it?
No, I'm sorry. I'm sorry if I wasn't clear about that. No, it said anybody who supports the Parnell testimonial should stop, and any bishop who's supporting the Parnell testimonial should withdraw. And clearly, Croke was the object of that. So they were condemning. Rome was condemning, at the instigation of the British government,
Parnell.
The support of the Parnell testimonial by nationalists in general, but particularly by members of the church and particularly by bishops.
Okay, thank you.
That got such a strong negative reaction from Catholics in Ireland, the episcopacy, the clergy, and the people, that it really screwed up relations between Ireland and Rome until Manning and Walsh set them right. One person mentioned to me their sense of the. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Jim. You had your hand up. Jim, please.
So a question on Walsh.
Yeah.
You're right that the British prevented him from being, they didn't prevent him from being appointed as Archbishop of Dublin.
Tried to.
But they did prevent him from being made a cardinal.
Correct.
And I'm just wondering if Leo did that, as well as condemning the plan of campaign, on the naive hope that giving in to the British might reconfigurate the circumstances under which ambassadors could be exchanged between the Vatican and London, despite the fact that in 1848 a bill did pass through the Lords and the Commons to facilitate that.
Right.
But because of an amendment in the Lords at the very end, which stipulated that the Pope couldn't be referred to as the Supreme Pontiff,
Right.
and that the Pope's ambassador had to be a layman.
Right.
So that's already on the statute book.
Yeah.
Was Pope Leo XIII naive?
Well, of course, in 1848, the papacy still controlled territory, so it was clear that the papacy was a state. By the 1880s, that was not the case, and so part of the objection in a number of quarters to diplomatic relations between the Church, between London and the Vatican was, who are we recognizing? He's not a head of state. He's just he's a clergyman. So. And about the cardinal, yes, I believe that's the case. It's not a story I'm as familiar with. So. But clearly, the Archbishop of Dublin should have been a cardinal, and Walsh wasn't. Yes, Jim.
This is maybe a left field kind of question, but as between Manning and Parnell, I'm wondering who's outmaneuvering who. It sounds to me as though Parnell is getting an awful lot out of this bargain without giving up an awful lot. Is that the case? And is that what would be the reasons for that? Are Manning's views about liberal democracy well enough known that, for example, Parnell can just kind of presume them and act politically on them?
Yeah, well, actually, a story I didn't tell because I couldn't fit it in a paper that was long enough already, was a fairly complex set of negotiations between Manning, Chamberlain, and Parnell over local government. Chamberlain, who was a liberal and a radical and unsympathetic with Manning over the education issue, had a scheme for local government, which he wanted to see implemented throughout the United Kingdom, so that there'd be local government for Wales, for Scotland. And his proposal to solve the Irish problem was to institute local government in Ireland that would basically deal with every aspect of Irish domestic affairs except. And so there was a long series of negotiations mediated by Manning between Parnell and Chamberlain over whether or not they could work something out. Now, Parnell was probably simply never going to be willing to accept anything short of a parliament in Dublin, and so it was probably a fool's errand in a certain sense. But, it's intriguing. I mean, if Chamberlain, who later became one of the strongest opponents of home rule and brought down the liberal government by splitting away the liberal unionists, if he and Parnell had been able to work out some kind of an agreement about local government in Ireland that satisfied all parties, the history of the United Kingdom and its relationship with Ireland would be quite different, and Queen Elizabeth would be visiting not just as a foreign head of state, but as a head of state of her own country. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Mine is just an observation. From what you have been talking about Bishop Cardinal Manning, he was a very strong fighter for peace and justice, not just for Ireland, but for in other corners of the world. I'm just wondering if your next presentation could be moving towards canonizing him, like Cardinal Newman is going to be canonized.
You would be very well aware that Manning was a strong supporter of working men and of the union movement, and famously defended and supported the London dock workers. At the very end of his life, and so was quite popular with the working class. And when he died, he had one of the largest funeral processions through London in the second half of the 19th century.
It seems from your presentation that during this period of time, the relationship between Ireland and London was, pretty dialogic, pretty civil.
Yeah.
And 35 years later, or less than 40 years later, was the uprising. Yeah. What happened?
They couldn't get home rule through. I mean, they tried and tried and tried. They tried 3 different times to get home rule through, and actually, it passed. It passed right before the First World War, and of course, Ulster was promising to resist with force of arms if need be to prevent home rule from being implemented. But when the war broke out, the British government, with the agreement of the Irish Parliamentary Party, put it on hold. And in the meanwhile, 1916, and at the end of the war, sentiment for a moderate constitutional settlement like home rule that would have kept Ireland in some way or another within the United Kingdom was at an end. It was not going to happen anymore. So yeah, it's a story. It's basically a story of missed opportunities to reconcile England and Ireland in the course of the 19th century.
Is there a single book that you would recommend that would cover these issues?
The most, unfortunately, I can't recommend a single book, but I mentioned the name of Emmett Larkin. Emmett Larkin he died a couple of years ago. He is the historian of the Catholic Church in Ireland, and he has a series of books about the relationship between the Catholic Church and the nationalist movement, the Parliamentary Party, and eventually the Irish state. So he's who I recommend. An old friend of mine came up to me afterwards and said, "Is there something about this story that helps us understand the relationship between Irish people and the Catholic Church today?" And I hope you all see that the answer to that question is absolutely. I mean, because, an alliance was concluded between the Catholic Church and the nationalist movement in 1884 that basically tied the church and what would be Irish political leadership and eventually the Irish state together in a way that helps explain, in a certain sense, the history of the relationship and some of the tremendous conflict and hostility that has emerged as church and state in Ireland, or church and society in Ireland, try to, kind of redefine themselves. But part of the reason for the closeness in the identification of being Irish with being Catholic and the difficulty of pulling all of that apart in some appropriate way has to do with this alliance between the church and the national movement in the period that we're looking at.
I wonder if you could comment on the line that you drew rightly to the Third Reich, sort of how it developed from what you've been talking about.
Sure. Well, in the simplest terms, Francine, the contrast is between a way of dealing with governments at the highest levels and the counter, in a sense, example that Manning offers, and the counter example that the United States, for example, offers. But because of Leo XIII's concern to reestablish the international position of the papacy, he wanted to again negotiate at the highest governmental levels, and especially over the Kulturkampf, which was bad for the church. He dealt directly, not person to person, but pretty directly through nuncios and intermediaries with Bismarck to achieve this. But that became the model, at least, of governmental Holy See relations in Germany through the rest of the empire, and it obviously continued, in the 1930s as well. So in a sense, negotiating a concordat with Hitler was not that different than negotiating a concordat with Bismarck, right? They'd done it before, and that's the way they did these things, and let's do it again and see if we can assure the church's position.
I think I can be loud enough.
No, for recording purposes, we need you to, so everyone will benefit from your wisdom.
Oh, no.
Video.
My ignorance asking questions. Is there any comparability between Leo's efforts to work out arrangements with Germany, for instance, and England, and today's efforts to work with China?
Yes.
Okay.
I hate to do this, but if you will Google my name and America magazine, you will find an article precisely on that question. But actually, in that case, it goes back to Napoleon. So what Francis has done in China is effectively modeled on the resolution of the conflict in France after the French Revolution and the concordat that was concluded between Pius VII and Napoleon in 1801, which involved, among other things, the wholesale removal of all of the bishops in France that already existed, and the appointment of a whole new batch of bishops. So it's a fascinating story. Okay, any last shots from anybody? Thank you all for your attention.